neat little thing.
Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Owen. Thank you very much for accepting my request for the second time over the past 2 years. I'm very grateful to you. You need absolutely no introduction. You've been Foreign Secretary from 1977 to 1979, and you've been leader of, and actually one of the founders of the Social Democratic Party in the 80s. Lord Owen, how do you enjoy your time out of frontline politics over the past 2 decades?
Well, I'm not really a politician now, but I would call myself more of a businessman. But
And a statesman.
I think that's a strange word, really. Whether I deserve it or whether I should even want it, I don't know, that term. Basically, I had a very enjoyable life in active politics. I enjoyed the House of Commons immensely, but once you give up the House of Commons, which I did in 1992, I then had a very active period in the Balkans as the EU negotiator with Cyrus Vance, the UN negotiator, and we were old friends from previous days when we were both foreign ministers. But then I left politics. The House of Lords is not a political place, really. Frankly, I think it's a joke at the moment. I think it's absolutely a travesty of what a second chamber should be, wholly patronized by the Prime Minister and paid, people literally pay to become peers now. It's always been there. When it occurred with Lloyd George, it carried on under Thatcher, it went to new heights under Blair, and now probably to stratospheric heights under Cameron. So the place is discredited, and it's not a real political forum. It does useful work as a revising chamber, but I don't consider myself, just because I'm a member of the House of Lords, to be a politician. It's useful for me. I'm writing books, and I have access to one of the best libraries in the world, which is what I had for 27 years when I was an MP. So that continuity is quite helpful. But I don't consider myself a politician merely because I'm in the House of Lords. Quite the opposite. I don't go very often. I'm attached to no political party. I'm an independent social democrat. And I don't feel it necessary to ritually vote when you know perfectly well it's going to make no difference whatever. So I vote on moral, ethical issues. I did put a lot of weight into trying to stop the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, which effectively is demolishing the English National Health Service. Only in England the health service exists still, thank goodness, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But again, that opposition in the House of Lords had no effect, so I wasted my time really opposing it, but perhaps it was good for people to see that there was opposition to it, but it made no difference. And we're now seeing this quite outrageous piece of legislation with not the slightest mandate given either to the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats, have destroyed one of the great institutions of post-war England and post-war Britain.
And for very long, actually, you were keen to reinstate in the national service. So, do you think that will happen in the foreseeable future?
Well, we've just had an election, so a Conservative government is running the health service into the ground, blaming it and still calling it National Health Service. I wouldn't even call it. I would call it the English National Health System. I don't believe it's any longer should be called the NHS. It's not national. It's completely different from what is happening in the other 3 parts of the United Kingdom. And it's a marketized health service heading towards the American system. The American system, if you've got a lot of money, is the best in the world. If you're poor and disenfranchised, it's third world quality. Even so, they spend huge amount, over 15% of GDP, private and public provision. This country, it's less than 10. So we still have in Britain the most cost-effective health service in the world. Will it exist by 2020? Not in England. Can it be recovered if we were to get a Labour government or a progressive alliance of opposition parties, which I think is the best hope? Yes, it could be. Be difficult, but reinstatement of the National Health Service is a noble objective and a particularly apt one for Jeremy Corbyn and the new leader of the Labour Party, because he actually is a signatory to the reinstatement bill which I and others designed before the last election. But he has to win the battle in the Labour Party. I think he will win that battle. I don't think there'll be the pusillanimous attitude to the NHS that we had out of Labour really from the moment they left office in 2010 to 2015. It wasn't Ed Miliband's fault. It was very difficult to get agreement inside. You can see that in the Labour leadership elections. You had two candidates, both who worked on health. Liz Kendall and
Andy Burnham.
Andy Burnham. They were both in the same area, and yet when you heard them actually speak their mind on the hustings, they had their concept of the health service was completely different. Hers was a totally Blairite, fragmenting the health service, having the market in wherever they wanted, pushing foundation hospitals, pushing all the time market solutions. And Andy Burnham was a more traditional, not foolish approach, modifying and adjusting it. But even he was not able to get a real restoring of the National Health Service in 2015. They'd got a lot more votes if they had, in my view.
And which one did you agree with? Liz Kendall?
Oh, of course. Well, of the two, Andy Burnham, of course. Liz Kendall's policies, I think, were completely crazy. If you want those policies, vote Conservative, is my attitude. No, I'm really obvious now that the reforms, take foundation hospitals, which was the hallmark of the Blair changes introduced in 2002 and opposed by various stages, as many as 90 Labour MPs, pushed through Parliament. Only a few weeks ago, the head of Monitor said that the standalone hospital was out of date and that they had to move on. So the policy has been abandoned by the Conservatives and still maintained by quite a lot of Labour people. So Jeremy Corbyn's first task and the new health minister, shadow health minister, who comes from Lewisham, an MP for Lewisham, and fought very well with us to keep their hospital open, so she knows the score. They have to change the Labour Party policy, and restoring the National Health Service would be a great rallying cry for Corbyn's Labour Party, and very much, after all, Nairn Bevan was a classical figure of the left, so it would be Labour restoring one of the left's greatest achievements. I look towards a more Bevanite approach to the health service in the next few months even. We have an NHS bill which is before the House at the moment, supported by the single Green MP, Caroline Lucas, but supported by the SNP, by a Liberal Democrat, by quite a number of Labour MPs, not just Jeremy Corbyn, but the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and others. So that will be a test for Labour, an early test really. Are they prepared to rally with others on big issues? And when I say others, that includes the SNP. Now, Labour could spend the next 5 years in a fruitless anti-SNP mood and nothing would allow them to work together. Or selectively, where there really is agreement, they can work together. And that is subject to the speech which I'm making in Queen Mary's. How to create a cross-party progressive alliance. It's a challenge also for the new leader of the Liberal Party. Do they spend their whole time the traditional Liberal way of, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, keeping open the option of doing something with the Conservatives or not. Well, on the health service, I think the Liberal Party has to choose. It was a terrible, terrible mistake to support the Conservative health bill. And a new leader has a chance to shift that, get out of that mode, and I hope he does. Yeah, I wish him well, Tim Farron.
It doesn't have much power with only 8
well, it doesn't matter
MPs.
tremendously. To a progressive alliance, the really crucial factor is not the Liberals any longer. The key question is, can Labour work with the Scottish nationalists? Now, the nature of an alliance is you don't agree on everything. You fight each other electorally.
Mhm.
If you're wise, as you build up strength and knowledge of each other and confidence, you do have electoral pacts. And I remind people in the speech which I'm making that...
Of your pact with the Liberals in the 1980s.
Yes,
But it happened 3 decades ago.
it happened. My great-grandfather was a Liberal in Wales, chairman of Glamorgan County Council, chairman of Ogmore Vale Liberal Party, and chairman of Ogmore Vale Liberal and Labour Association. And they did do deals. There were 30 deals done in the 1906 election, which allowed Labour to come back in. It's seen by many people as the moment when Labour began to sow the seeds of the destruction of the Liberal Party. I don't believe that. I believe the Liberal Party destroyed itself. I don't believe that it was destroyed only by the pact. I think the pact was a very secondary issue. But nevertheless, history is a telling element which politicians are foolish to ignore. And that was a breakthrough for a great progressive government. I mean, you can have your views about the Liberal, but the great Liberal government of 1906 going on into the big constitutional reforms. Then there's another myth that you hear, you know, that constitutional reform has to be all-party, academic, above politics. That's bullshit. The facts of the matter are that most big and important elements in politics have to be fought for. They don't get achieved. Sometimes, of course, if you could get all-party agreement, it would be a good idea. A constitutional convention now is necessary. Cameron has ruled it out. He doesn't want to be involved in it this side of the next election. So for the next 5 years, the field is free, really, for the opposition parties. Do they get together? Does Corbyn strike a deal with the SNP in Westminster and let Labour and the SNP fight it out in Scotland? Well, I think you could. I think Nicola Sturgeon is a very interesting figure, and I think it's very interested in constitutional change, and she is, if you like, a utilitarian nationalist. She's somebody who thinks you choose to separate because of you can't get a result that is favourable to the Scottish people, but if you're an existentialist nationalist, you think you never can. So there's no deal on the table that would satisfy some Scottish nationalists. Theoretically, she is open to a system. So can we build a 4-nation federal union in the UK? And can we reflect the 4 nationalities which make up the UK? Scots, I've got no English blood in me at all, I'm Welsh, a little bit of Irish, and the English. These 4 great nationalities can, in my view, and should, stick together. But they won't stick together in the present arrangement. We have to show more respect for a union in which the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish from Northern Ireland will always be in a minority. So we need to give them protected powers, if you like. And the obvious vehicle is the House of Lords. So you make the House of Lords elected from the 4 nations that make up the UK, and you look at the representation differently from the Commons. In the Commons, you'll trying to get exactly, as far as you can, a mirror image reflected of the voters' views back in the House of Commons. We don't do it. We need proportional representation, but for a variety of reasons, we may not get that. I think we should. But in the House of Lords, you wouldn't need to have numerical exactness. The US Senate sends 2 senators from every state. That means very small population terms, states have equal standing with others. And that is a way of building in respect for minorities, and then you can have a threshold vote in which you can't make changes or you can't instigate changes without a certain percentage threshold. So all these things can be discussed. We've got lots of time, and if Jeremy Corbyn has made a good appointment of a shadow cabinet person with some standing, John Trickett, to be the one to come forward with proposals for a constitutional convention. But so Jeremy Corbyn clearly wants it. The question is, can it be delivered? And a lot will depend on a relationship which Jeremy Corbyn, I hope, will start to build between himself and Nicola Sturgeon.
Lord Owen, you talked about the cross-party alliance. The last time that it happened in British politics, it was back in your time as the leader of the SDP. And then Dennis, some time ago, I did Dennis Hilly's last interview, and then I talked about the SDP and asked him why he didn't join your party, and he said partly it was internally divided. So and just like the Labour Party is now currently. So do you think that a party which is internally divided, could it be successful in future?
Well, sadly, Dennis is not here to have this conversation, although I had a long conversation with him only 2 months ago. And we talked about politics, but many other things. He was a remarkable man. He was my boss for effectively 4 years in the Ministry of Defence from 1966 to 70, and when I was Minister for the Navy. So I'm a huge admirer of him. Now, I don't know what he meant exactly by we were internally divided. If he said the SDP was internally divided, he's correct. We didn't realise we were quite so divided until we got into and left the Labour Party and were fighting. And it is a very sad, tragic division, no doubt about that. Roy Jenkins and then later Shirley and Bill Rogers took the view that we had to merge with the Liberal Party. From the moment you start to go down that route, you change the whole dynamics of a pact. A pact does not require mergers. A pact is faced by a distorted voting system of first past the post. You combine together, if you like, to use the jargon of your generation, you game the system. You know you can't win, so you say some seats, you X party have got better chance of winning, therefore we'll stand down, and you, in return, stand down in a seat where we've got the best chance. You won't do it in anything much more than 30 to 70 seats out of 650. But it means that you can defeat the unfairness of the system. You can't do it unless you have a broad measure of agreement, otherwise it's seen as very cynical by the electorate, and they don't like it. Now, we had an arrangement for the SDP as a new party and the Liberal Party to work together, but it does depend on your objective. If your objective is to merge, well, of course, the arrangements are different, and that means you don't have disagreements, or you try not to have any disagreement on policy. If there are natural disagreements in policy, and there always are within the Liberals, I mean, you know, of all the gang of four, I was the one who knew the Liberal Party better than any of them. I lived surrounded by them in the West Country. The Liberals are strong in Cornwall, they're strong in Devon, and they're strong in Somerset, or they used to be, completely wiped out. But Plymouth never went Liberal. Why? Well, I say it's history again. Plymouth was a Cromwellian city, and Devon and Cornwall were for the king. And there is a built-in radicalism that seems to survive through the centuries. go to East Anglia and you look at the map and you see a non-conservative MP, either a Liberal or a Labour, it's almost always where Cromwell was strong.
And look back in 1976 leadership election within the Labour Party. The candidates were Anthony Crosland, whom you served actually as junior minister when he was foreign secretary, Dennis Healey, Roy Jenkins, and James Callaghan. And four of them, they fought in Second World War. Whereas last time's leadership contest for the who will become Labour Party leader, none of them actually had fought in a war
It's not their fault. They're just younger. Thank goodness we only had 2 world wars. I mean, I'm the last generation. I'm 77, and I, in a way, lived through the First World War. I was born in 1938, and I can remember being bombed in Plymouth, one of the cities that was bombed most of all in the world. I spent quite a few of my nights as a small boy either under the stairs or on a little sort of metal bomb shelter or out in the garden, So, I mean, I know about that war. My father was away abroad fighting in France and then in North Africa. And when the war was over, a strange man with a moustache was in front of me with my mother, and I shook him by the hand and said, "Good afternoon, sir." It was my father. I didn't recognize him. So, but that generation is gone now, so we can't, that's not a problem. The problem is, or would be, if we are seeing a fall off of quality in people who become MPs. I mean, the people you named in that election, I incidentally voted first for Roy Jenkins out of friendship still, although I was already getting more disillusioned with his commitment to the social democratic view of life, and he was obviously becoming more liberal. Then I voted for Dennis Healey with enthusiasm and affection, and then I voted for Jim Callaghan. So I was not a Callaghanite. It was a great surprise when he appointed me foreign secretary. But I think he was an example of a man who becomes a better person and a wiser and a more broader base in that great office of state as Prime Minister, having held all the 4 great offices of state. I think he was an exceptionally well-grounded Prime Minister, and it's sad we didn't have him a little longer than from the period that we did.
And very surprised when he appointed you as Foreign Secretary, because Dennis Healey, he told me that there were 2 groups in the Labour Party, those who wanted him to become Foreign Secretary and those who thought that he was already the Foreign Secretary. So very surprised when he appointed you in that.
Well, that's a period, that description is a period when Dennis was Defence Secretary, and that jibe is made that there were half the Foreign Office thought he should be Foreign Secretary and half the Foreign Office thought he already was. By the time he became Chancellor of the Exchequer, I don't think there was any doubt that he wasn't Foreign Secretary, and because he was so completely taken up with the dire economic consequences and the IMF and everything like that. So during that period, Jim Callaghan was initially Foreign Secretary and took us through the referendum. And then when Wilson retired, he became Prime Minister. He appointed Tony Crosland. Tony was only Foreign Secretary for just a little over a year, and then sadly died, and I then took over. And Jim Callaghan talked to Dennis about whether he should go to the Foreign Secretary, and they both decided that it was better for him to stay as Chancellor. I think that was a sadness for Dennis in one respect, because he always wanted to be Foreign Secretary, and would have been a very good one.
And as a former Foreign Secretary, do you think that if you want to become Prime Minister, as Jeremy Corbyn would like to become one in future, do you think is he right to not push on the button, to not press the button?
Well, a man must do what a man must do, and we have always had in British life a tolerance, and it was reflected in many different ways. I believe that a woman has a right to an abortion, and as a doctor, I'm ready to do one. I never did one and wouldn't relish it, but I would do it as a service and a belief. There are doctors who do not believe that there should be abortion, and they are not obliged to do it. And we all respect that they can be good doctors, and a way is found that they do not participate in abortions. I think we have to accept the fact in politics that there are people who are, if not pacifists, some are conscientious objectors and some who don't fight in wars, and others are people who are very against nuclear weapons, quite rightly drawing a distinction. These are weapons of mass destruction. They are very, very horrendous weapons. We are actually obliged by the Non-Proliferation Treaty to take our weapons down, the weapon states. And they hold the view that you should never use them. Now, I've been in charge of the Polaris program in 68, 70, and as Foreign Secretary I was very much involved in nuclear strategy. I have never wanted a super sophisticated, all singing, all dancing nuclear deterrent, and it's more important that we have a conventional deterrent. I would still keep what I call a minimum deterrent, but we do not need the Trident missile and its full costs. It is designed to penetrate anti-ballistic missile defences that are still around Moscow. We don't need that any longer, and certainly Britain doesn't. It's probably wise that while we have this grand deterrent, that if Russia has it, America has it, and Russians would say if America has it, we should have it. I think that Britain doesn't need it, personally. So I would welcome a minimum deterrent. It's something I've argued for over the decades, both in government and out of government. And I believe actually in saying the same thing when you're in government as being out of government. So I don't decry Corbyn's wish not to be involved in that. I think it's difficult for people to understand, but he's already a very unusual politician. He's been a long time in opposition. He's a genuinely left Labour person.
Very consistent in his views.
He is, and I think the public can live with this. We dealt with this problem with Michael Foot. Michael Foot was not a pacifist, far from it, but he was absolutely opposed to nuclear weapons and a believer in unilateral nuclear disarmament. He was, you could almost say, second in the government after Callaghan, in a senior position, and if there was a deputy prime minister, you could have called him that, I suppose. But he had nothing whatever to do with nuclear questions. He didn't have any, there were 4 ministers who met to discuss nuclear policy, myself, Dennis Healey, Jim Callaghan, and the Defence Secretary, Fred Mully. And we discussed the strategy and the replacement of Polaris issues, and we were also involved in the implementation. Michael Foot was never involved in any of those issues. Now, it's different, of course, not to have a Prime Minister involved, but perfectly possible. These are collective decisions. A lot of people get the nuclear issue wrong. Some of the academics get it wrong. They think this issue is entirely between a Prime Minister and the Chief of Defence Staff, that it's a decision totally reserved to the Prime Minister. Well, of course, in the sense there can only be one person who finally says yes. But that doesn't have to be the Prime Minister. If he wishes to delegate it to a group of other ministers, it can be done, and that's what would happen under Jeremy Corbyn. There isn't any point in keeping him in place if he's already determined never to press the button. It's better to get rid of it. Now, in fairness, he would like to get rid of it. But he seems to be a Democrat, and if so, it's refreshing. He doesn't believe in presidential government. We've had enough presidential government. It reached its apotheosis over Tony Blair, and the Labour Party, I think, is sickened by this whole urge for the single leader and the great sort of mirroring the American president. I'm very happy to go back to a sort of Attlee type Prime Minister who just happens to be the most successful Labour Prime Minister we've ever had by a mile. So if that was what happened under Corbyn, I think many people would welcome it, and certainly I would. So I don't hold his views on quite a number of these issues, but tolerance and democracy go together, you know.
Hand
People
in
forget
hand.
that. Yeah, you can't have a proper democracy without tolerance. And I always think the House of Commons is better when it reflects all the widths of opinions, the religions, the sexes, the ages.
But for instance, Ukraine, they just gave up their nuclear capabilities and then they got invaded by Russia. So would it be a danger if we give up our nuclear capabilities that we get invaded by Russia or other countries?
Well, Ukraine is a very
capabilities?
bad example of where the world gives the impression to people that they will support them and then doesn't. And in this particular case, Britain was one of the signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, which dealt with this issue and promised the Ukrainians that they would not have their territory invaded. It was not a guarantee like an Article 5 commitment in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but it nevertheless was given to reassure them. They were giving up huge numbers of missiles and warheads and returning them to the Russian Federation, and we all signed this agreement, including Russia and the United States. So it's a big rebuff to international order, what happened in the Crimea, and the Crimea is still not recognized and should not be recognized. And if Russia doesn't come to a negotiation over the Crimea, I mean, realistically, Russia will not give back the Crimea, but equally realistically, nor will we recognize it. And within that deadlock, it's possible to have a negotiation and some boundary changes of mutual advantage. Russia is sitting in a place called Transnistria, which is between Moldova and Ukraine, and it's not recognized by the rest of the world either. Russia could give up Transnistria tomorrow without any serious problem. It wouldn't just be a face-saving mechanism, it would actually give the Ukraine some stability, which they need at this moment, and a very clear sign that they were getting back something for the loss of Crimea. Now, these are the sort of world negotiations that are very badly needed, and there's too much dry tinder around and too much disputed boundaries. So I'm personally adamant that we should not recognize Crimea, we should negotiate. And if we opened up negotiations between the foreign ministers, I believe we could find a solution, just as the Permanent Five of the Security Council, with the help of Germany, found a solution for Iran. And I think we should do that. And the sooner the better, in my view, because I think it's the tension that is built up in the three Baltic states is very bad, and the deterioration in relations between Russia and America is being felt every day in the continued horror of Syria and the civil war and the loss of life and the humanitarian disaster that's represented in Syria. We did have a negotiation at one stage which was to get out of chemical weapons out of Syria, and that same type of negotiation should be started urgently in Syria. But you have to have a dialogue across the whole agenda, in my view, and restore, you don't have to restore trust even, you just have to restore working relationships between signatories of the UN and members, particularly permanent members of the Security Council, that have an obligation to try and find a solution within the terms of the UN Charter to any conflict or tension area.
But Lord Owen, do you think that we're about to see a new proxy war between the United States and Russia, but this time in Syria?
No, I don't believe we are.
Well, it seems like it's happening already.
But it's not a proxy war.
There were the shots of American forces, the Syrian border, Russian.
Well, there aren't American forces on the ground in Syria, and it is a bad development that the Russians are now putting down more than troops than they need to defend the airfield. Look, Russia has had a treaty agreement since 1971 to hold a naval port in Syria, in Tartar. They are not going to give that up because of America or Britain or France or anybody else wants them to. They are there by invitation of what they consider to be the president of the country, President Assad. Incidentally, actually, what the UN considered to be the president of the country. Now, that's a very different situation for the Americans overflying and bombing Syria without the authority of the UN. So, inasmuch as UN authority goes on, the Russians have more claim to be there than we have. However, we all know it's a country in which Assad's writ does not run. It possibly runs for a third of the country, maybe less, and probably getting less. Why have Russia gone in? Cut out all the flannel. Russia's got in there because Assad sent a message to Putin, and probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe 6, to say, I'm losing this war. I just to warn you, I may have to take my forces out of Damascus and go to the coastal area. And it's increasingly getting difficult to go from Damascus to the coastal area because of the inroads that have been made and the difficulty of keeping open the road connection, where it comes very close to Lebanon. So Russia's in there, in my view, predominantly defensive. The trouble is that defensive becomes offensive. We all know that. And before you know where you are, you have incidents like they've got 2 planes that have violated Turkish airspace. If they do it again, the Turks are quite capable of shooting them down.
And just 2 last questions. The first one is that now the political frame in British politics is changing. The Labour Party, they shifting to the left, and Tories are very swiftly shifting to the right, and the Lib Dems, they were just wiped out the political frame. And so, and the centre ground, it seems that it's been vacuumed, actually. So, in your opinion, which party will fill that vacuum, which is now in the centre ground?
Well, I'm not objective. I am a social democrat. I've never been a liberal. I never want to be a liberal. If I could have been a liberal, that's by my heritage, and that's where there's a bigger political base in the West Country. So I'm prejudiced. I wish to see more Labour governments than Conservative governments. I'm a Democrat. I realise that there is an alternation of power, and that's actually a good thing. But I don't want to have a perpetuity of Conservatives, and I want to have a good social democratic government back. Now, the Labour Party has chosen to reassert some of its socialist principles. You can't deny them that right. And they have seen their socialist principles torn up in their very face on the issue I talked to you about. I'm still very angry about the Labour Party's attitude to the National Health Service. It's disgraceful. And in that sense, I'm a militant lefty. I find myself, therefore, not immediately saying, of course I'm a centrist, and proud of it. Social Democrats are centrists. But I can see where I sense a policy which Labour has long held, and it's not a peculiarly left-wing policy in National Health Service. And now I think that Corbyn will defend it and restore it if he can. So I start with at least one part of my deep political beliefs quite welcoming him. Now, I have other beliefs. I think it would be ridiculous to get out of NATO. Absolutely absurd. We talked about the problems with Crimea, the problems with Ukraine, the problems with the Baltic states, the problems with Syria. We have a lot of problems. They're nothing like the old Cold War problems of the USSR, which was a hugely powerful force. The Russian Federation is nowhere near the same strength. But nevertheless, and America is more understanding and less active. It's above all now no longer the only superpower, which it was for a short stage from 1989 onwards. China is now a superstate, in my view, and we should treat it as such. But, I mean, China is much stronger than the Russian Federation. So I think you should get us a balance about all of this. I therefore will oppose, in as much as I can, any attempt for Corbyn's Labour Party to come out of NATO. As far as the European Union is concerned, I want them to be stronger and demanding more out of the renegotiation, and not going along with a sort of Cameron soft shoe shuffle renegotiation. We need substantive restructuring of the European Union, because we are giving the Eurozone the right to be integrated and effectively a federal Eurozone as the only way of getting that Euro financial arrangement to work. And there will need to be fiscal transfer union with it. Now, if they must understand, if we're going to give that, which we've got the power to block, then they must understand that the Eurozone group must be matched by a non-Eurozone group. And there are quite a lot of countries. I mean, if you were having this conversation 4 years ago, you'd have said Sweden was very likely to join the Eurozone. Now, I'd say it's very open whether Sweden will go into the Eurozone. Denmark, politicians have always been edging towards the Eurozone. I'm not sure its people are. And the failure of the Eurozone is here and now, and they are still not grappling with it. So I'd like to see Labour have a tougher European stance. But again, when you look at what's going to happen, the Conservatives have chosen to get rid of the tax credit system in the next 2 years rather than spread the changes over 4 or 6 years. It's a political choice. They want to be free of this by the time there's a 2019 election to help them in the two. Well, Labour's not going to put up with it. They're going to oppose it, and quite right there. Now again, the centrist Labour Party were equivocating about this. Well, I don't think there's room for much equivocation on welfare payments. There is a very strong case for moving towards, and always has been, integration of benefits and the tax system. Very difficult to do, and you need a buoyancy in revenues to overcome some of the anomalies that go with change. But the way the Tories are dealing with getting rid of tax credits is penal in some respects. Now, many families are going to be very seriously affected. The Institute of Fiscal Studies makes this clear. Jeremy Corbyn will oppose that. I don't consider that's particularly left-wing or far left-wing. I think that is a social democratic position. Keep an open mind about tax credits. That was introduced largely by Labour, and in my view was a necessary transition to integrating tax and benefit. And then they lost their nerve, and they didn't go, they just started to rely on tax credits. Then, by only relying on tax credits, you were subsidising people in ways which were very distortive to the economy. It was only a transitionary arrangement. So I think tax credits has to go. The question is, how does it go? And the mechanism and the time that you take. And for the left, me, I consider myself left, centre-left, you must give a highest priority to protecting the poor, the disabled, the people who are not able to make up that income loss and will be suffering as a result of it.
But it's
Now,
not an easy
I'm
task.
fed up with this argument that's going on in this country at the moment about depicting everything that Labour says as the far left. What I think is wrong is that Labour started to be so centrist you can't recognise them. And that's why people are fed up with it. And they don't recognise it as their party. And I mean, all I can tell you is all these big figures we've talked about, Dennis Healey, Roy Jenkins, even in one stage in his career, certainly, Tony Crossan, certainly, Jim Callaghan, Harold Wilson, George Brown, these people would have fought for the disenfranchised and the disadvantaged in any changes in the tax structure. They would have done it naturally, and they would have fought. And they wouldn't have been ashamed of it, and they wouldn't have thought this is far left. And, you know, we have a rich commentariat now. They're all on vast salaries, these journalists and TV commentators, in the ways that they didn't have in 30 years ago, even 20 years ago. And they're protecting their own, and they are not reflecting the realities.